Thank you everyone for taking the time to come and to listen to what I have to say. And I understand that we have some people who are familiar with this subject, other ones who are old-timers, have had exposure to this for many decades. We have those that are skeptical, and that's always a good thing as well, because we have to always ask questions from those who would stand in front of you and bring forth information. We have to be accountable for what we say, and I hope that I can provide you with enough information to start seeing things perhaps a little differently. We are living now in a technological age upon which there is instantaneous communication and instantaneous broadcasting of information. And while that may be good in some respects, it is also a vehicle for a great deal of misinformation and disinformation as well. And so we always have to take a very critical eye. That's different from skepticism. Skepticism means that you look at everything negatively, while a critical eye allows you to look at things rationally from a non-biased position and to see what is being promoted. I have spent literally a lifetime in this field. I grew up in this field. My parents were co-workers for George Adamski. I spent time with George Adamski. I have witnessed his contacts upon occasion and since. I had to see these crafts all over the world. I am a professional pilot, an airline pilot, and I have seen these crafts all over the world as well upon occasion. I've been flying airplanes for 42 years. 30 of them as a professional pilot. And so my exposure to this field comes from a factual standpoint. I don't deal with wishful thinking, I don't deal with conjecture, and I don't deal with fantasy. I deal with facts. And my entire family was involved dealing with facts. When we were involved in the 1960s in this field, NASA, Dr. Loma, 22 scientists at Goddard Space Flight Center invited us to come to them. And upon sitting down with 22 scientists, they talked about the nature of these crafts. They knew all about them. Who pilots them, the intelligence, and the people that come along inside of them, the propulsion system. This was not, by any stretch of the imagination, unknown science or unknown circumstance for them. This wasn't some fairy tale land. They had already acquired technology from the many previous incidences that led into the 40s and 50s, whether you know them as Roswell, Cortez, Aztec, Alamosa, many different places, not just in the United States, but also in Europe as well, and South America, in which they recovered pieces of crafts intact and semi-intact, along with the bodies of the occupants. And so I understand that this is considered by many to be a fringe type of thought or concept. First of all, that we are not alone in the universe, or even in the solar system. For some, they see this as a normal principle extension of life. For others, they see that as something that challenges them either scientifically and religious-wise or what have you. And I think that by the end of today, we will see that there is enough evidence, more than enough evidence, to show that these spacecraft that come here is something that is real, and we have interacted with them for thousands of years. Our historical records are full of them. Whether you look in the ancient records of the Chinese or East India, whether you look at the biblical records, you have the wheel within the wheel, the flying scroll, the flying shield, and so on and so forth. And so as you look historically from across this planet and the sections of civilizations, you will see that each one of them has had descriptions of flying crafts, people who come from the sky who interacted with them, brought a message of progress, and then returned to whence they came. You will find it in Latin America with the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, the South Pacific region. Also, when you look at what type of a history we share, we see that this intelligence is not any different from us, other than a little bit more advanced, and it comes there to share with us their thoughts and concepts, and also to give us a helping hand. Whenever we have been in trying times, we see a larger number of these type of crafts being reported. And so we need to look at this with a rational thought. As I mentioned before, with NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, they knew all this information. My father, one of the scientists, said to him, how many extraterrestrial people, human beings, do you think are walking amongst us at this particular moment? My father took down a piece of paper and wrote down the number. The scientist wrote down his number. They exchanged pieces of paper, and the numbers were the same. This is the platform upon which I've grown up. 4 months later, Colonel Freeman at the Pentagon requested my father to come to brief them and show the Adamski films. His comments, you'll find in the book, Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery, Colonel Freeman and his staff in the Pentagon said, these are the best films in civilian hands that I have seen. Not the best films that exist, because they have more films by far, but the best films in civilian hands. And so when I had an opportunity about 2 years ago to meet with a group of scientists from the New Mexico platform, for 3 days we held symposiums about this particular subject. And we talked about these crafts, the propulsion systems, and the occupants as well. And they were fully aware and convinced. And so I understand, having spent a lifetime in this field, that the UFO arena is highly misrepresented. And there is a great deal of confusion and a great deal of conjecture that is thrown out. Right? But we have to ask for proof and sustainability. I know many people are not a fan of George Adamski. Not necessarily because of his films and his pictures, because those are rock solid. The negatives have been examined. The labs have put out affidavits to the truth and validity of these crafts, the size and the type of pictures that are taken. 33 feet in diameter, taken through a 6-inch telescope or a 15-inch telescope, and so on and so forth. So these pictures, which George gave out to everyone, whether the civilians who came to visit him, to the military, who often came to him, or the government officials, of which he had a pass to go to, he gave this material freely because he always said, these are the people that make the decisions that affect the rest of us. So they need to have accurate information. And that was given freely. Some of what you'll see today is the motion picture films that George had taken. It's taken in many different countries and many different time frames and periods. And you will see yourself some of these crafts in motion. We began, the DVD was showing what's called high flyers. And these are the type of crafts that you see skipping along the top of the atmosphere. In the evening, you can see them about an hour and a half after sunset, as the Terminator moves across the front of the planet, or the line between light and dark, the poles between north and south become very hyperactive. And this becomes sensitive to be able to transport along those magnetic lanes of force. For every, what we call that, 10 centimeters, there's about 1,500 lines of magnetic force. This is the force they use to travel on. This is the force they use to power their machinery, their planet, and they do not have any problems with what we call the toxic wastes of all the different fossil fuels that we have, or they are a great deal more sensitive to the geophysical changes upon which the planet goes through, which we are going through right now. And in fact, the entire solar system is going through right now. And so the films and the pictures that I show you, many people throw out accusations. Not one of them has produced any fact, any scientific evidence, any photographic evidence to support their opinions. There's a big difference between opinion and fact. And so when you look at that material from George Adamski, some people take it on one side, and then of course his statements on the other side. And the greatest problem we have is that most people have accepted the information that's given to them from the space agencies that are controlled mostly by the military, one source. So if I ask you, do you believe what your government tells you or your military tells you? Most of you say no. But sometimes the very same person will say, well, this information comes from the space agency, thereby it must be true. And we'll take a look at that and see how true that is. Right? And so the problem that most people have is they can accept the claims, and it's easy to claim, that intelligence comes from the far reaches of space, from deep space. Because we don't have the technology to go there and determine whether that's true or false. So it becomes a detachment. Well, that's on the other side of the galaxy, how many light years away, and so on and so forth. So the questioning is not as intense. But when you make a statement that there's intelligent life within this solar system, then people start to get heartburn. Because they want to believe that the temperature of Venus is 800 degrees. While at the same time, the Russians say it's half of that. I will show you a picture that's broadcast on NASA's own platform, Mariner 10 picture. And maybe you can pull that up for me. One picture from Mariner 10. And you want you to look at this.
Is it this one?
It's the blue white planet.
One. Right, yes.
That one. Here's one picture from Mariner 10. I want you to look at that. Does that look 800 degrees to you with blue and clouds and polar ice caps on both sides? How do you have the polar ice caps at 800 degrees? And then the Russians say, well, it isn't 800 degrees, it's even less than half of that. The question there is if you have instrumentation that is so erroneous that you already have a 100% error in it to begin with, then you have to start looking at the rest of the information you're being given. Then you're told that it is not only 800 degrees, it is 8 times denser than boiling oil. And the atmosphere moves at 400 miles an hour. And then they tell you, we go to Venus multiple times with our probes, and we land with a parachute. Tell me the physics that allows that to happen. What kind of parachute allows you to do that? So when you start to see contradictory information, you must say, things aren't quite, shall we say, kosher in Denmark, right? You have to question it. And that's what we do vividly. So when you start to find out that the information that comes from our solar system is much different than what is automatically put in textbooks or thrown at you on your phone news. I've got on my phone news in the last month, aliens must be purple and they must look like bugs and so on and so forth. And it goes across and against all the rules of astrobiology and biochemistry. If you ask any biochemical scientist, Dr. Palomar, who wrote the book, The Principles of Life, it deals specifically with the organic substances, the RNA, the DNA, the compositions of life that come from space and rain down on this planet 2 tons every day. All the other planets, which it flows behind, an organic leaves behind as it orbits through the solar system. That's why you have meteorites from Mars and Antarctica. We're sharing the same substances. And you start to realize that we're coming from the same general cooking pot. A week ago, because they have nothing else to do but theorize, a group of scientists says, well, there must have been life on Mars 2 billion years ago. Well, they tell you when you go to school, Darwinism, evolution, that over a period of time of 3.5 billion years, life has developed on this planet. But then they think, I'm going to tell you that life was 2 billion years earlier over there. The exact reverse of the very principles that they tell you to believe. So it's up to a rational mind to say, What kind of sense does that make? Let's try the Saturn picture. Cassini.
Cassini, yep.
This is a picture from Cassini. It's also on the NASA space catalog. It is one of the last pictures taken by the probe as it goes through the atmosphere and burns out. Now I want you to look at this picture very carefully. Here's the probe, here's the ring, here's the atmosphere, and what do you see here? Cumulonimbus clouds. The same type of clouds you see in your own atmosphere. So then you have to think water vapor, temperature inversion, uplifting action, all the things that produce clouds and allows them to go straight and grow straight when they tell you that the atmosphere of Saturn is going along like the atmosphere of Venus at hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour. So you have to look for yourself. Nobody just hands it to you on a plate. Let's look at Mars. The first one with the small caps. Here's a picture we're all familiar with of Mars with the polar ice caps. So let's talk about Mars. Atmosphere, atmospheric pressure, temperature. If you look at National Geographic, they admit to temperatures close to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what, about 24 years Celsius. And with the polar ice caps, they also state that there is enough water, underground water, to literally cover portions of this planet to large sections. A year ago, our scientists said, we have discovered salt water on Mars. In 1963, George Adamski wrote in the Science of Life course, Mars has to a great degree salt water. How many years prior to that NASA release is that? 50 years. So when he talks about conditions on other planets and in space, the firefly effect that John Glenn saw almost 10 years later in 63, George talked about in 55. He talked about atmosphere on Mars, atmosphere on the moon, and we'll go along and show NASA's pictures, and their own publication, the chronological listing of lunar events from NASA. It reports mists, moving lights, colored lights, clouds, all there at this particular date. We had already aware of the circumstances before we went to the moon of what was going on there. Show the next picture of Mars. You see, during certain seasons, it is much more covered with ice and snow. So, even if we take the skeptics at their most base, water, atmosphere, temperature, organic materials, by their own admission, this is the composites of life on Mars. Dr. Jastrow, who ran the Viking mission, he said NASA has got a skeleton in its closet. And that skeleton is that they had already discovered life on Mars during the Viking mission. And he said that the scientists don't want to talk about it because there's political pressure and other types of pressure that keep them in large masses of coming out. A few have talked about it. But here's a most interesting fact. In 2003, we took the same instrumentations that we used on Viking. It's documented. We went to the Atacama Desert. I have it right here on black and white. And based upon the instruments that we used on Viking in the Atacama Desert, Argentina, the results said there's no life on Earth. Not too good instrumentation. All right? So it comes to, we have a question on that. Is everybody involved in a conspiracy? Absolutely not. We have political scientists who are paid to say something. We have self-indulgent, shall we say, marketeers and profiteers who have their own egotistical reasons for doing things. We have the natural scientists, and we have all the people that are working at JPL in front of computers and NASA and what have you. And the very easiest thing to do is to change the calibration of the instruments. How is that possible, you say? Well, Volkswagen just got sued for $4 billion for changing the calibrations on their instrumentations for several years in order to be able to sell their product. Now you have a space probe. And as this probe gets ready in the laboratory, in order to get ready, the amount of technicians begin fewer and fewer until the last day when that thing finally gets completed and gets ready to ship off to the rocket center. You've got 2 that are doing final preparations on it. If I want to keep from the public the actual value of what is out in space, but still myself know it, all I do is change the calibration. I fly airplanes for a living. If the mechanic does not adjust the altimeters and my basic instruments to the proper calibration, they're worthless. I run into everybody else and vice versa. But I have to accept that value if I don't know the calibration error. So when you download all this information to these computers and these people who are working, they're unaware of the calibration differential. And they accept it for what it is. But the rest of the people who know what they're doing can make that adjustment. So you ask me, why the resistance? Why this continual deception? And it's very simple. If you take just the amount of sightings and pictures, motion pictures, telescopic pictures, witnesses that happened from the 40s to the 60s, Project Blue Book said there were about 800 a day. By the Air Force's own most skeptical reduction, 15% could not be explained by any means possible. And they tried temperature inversions like Alan Hynek, and radiation fog, convection fog, and anything else they could come up with. All right? So 15%. That's a fair number. So now we have crafts, and you can look at the newspaper archives in which I carry volumes of this with me. In every major capital across the planet, you could see these crafts, witnessed by people, photographed. And we had the same opportunity. In 1963, we were in downtown Washington. There were 30 other witnesses and the newspaper reporter coming out of the department store. And above the city hovered, at 1,200 feet, this craft. And we all looked about it. And the next day it's in the newspaper. I have the article right here. 1963, over downtown Washington. And so my father said, I need to go find out what this is. He goes to the Library of Congress, starts alphabetically A for Adamski, opens the book, flying saucers have landed, inside the spaceships. There are the same photographs that we witnessed this craft, and all these other people did as well. He sent a letter to Adamski. Adamski says, I'm coming 3 months from now to Washington to lecture to the Air Force Reserves. And when he talked to them, they were lined in the front row, all of them with their military uniforms and medals hanging from the front of their chest. They were all there to find out information. And we became good friends, and then continued on from there. So, as I said before, I try to give people a renewed thought of what actually transpired in those years. I try to give people a connection to what is actually going on. Not this hocus-pocus monster stories. That's not going to get anywhere. That is designed to take you into the fear factor, to keep you away from the subject, to let your imaginations run wild, and to keep the people unsettled. It's basic psychology 101. Governments have been using on us in the population for as long as we keep recorded records. It's nothing new. So these are all things we have to talk about. So we have now 2 definitive types of, shall we say, backgrounds of information. One that's based on this, historical records, government, shall we say, studies, Project Grudge, Magnet, Sign, Azuma, Blue Book, Condon Report. I mean, these are just the ones in the United States that they tell you about, not the ones that every particular agency does on their own. And then we have the other side of this, which is quite different from where this subject started. And I think it's very important, and part of what I try to do is to remind people to question. First of all, in the not-too-distant past, you were told that these craft were actually developed by the Nazis, and that Nordics were in there speaking German. But if you do this much research, you will find photographs over Europe of the same type of crafts in 1918 already. The Germans didn't come out in 1933. Peenemünde didn't even start until 10 years after that. The Hunnebo didn't even fly, and was based with propellers on the bottom. So what happens is, either by UFO personalities or by organizations who wish to make this subject as ridiculous as possible, they use a political ploy called insinuation. Throw it out, cause the damage. When they're confronted, they rarely retract it, and then they go on to the next accusation, because it is all about damage. That is their purpose. And so we have to be a little smarter than that. I've known these people all my life. I know their tactics, how they work, where they come from, their agendas. It isn't difficult. All you have to do is watch them. They expose themselves way too easily. And so we talk about that. So obviously, they weren't Germans landing among the contactees in the 40s. Kenneth Arnold didn't see them. All the other ones had nothing to do with Germans. But this is a push. The next thing they try to tell you is, of course, that certain circumstances were actually developed by ourselves. So the Roswell incident was dummies that we threw out of parachutes in order to do some testing. But then they were exposed that they didn't develop those tests for another 7 to 10 years after the Roswell incident. And so, once again, most people don't ask, they don't research, so they combine it together. We are so easily deterred from what's going on and redirected. Another thing, more recently, we talk about chemtrails. Now, have we sprayed chemicals in the air in the past? Oh, we do it all the time in agriculture. Absolutely. We spray our fields. We sow clouds in order to make rain. But nowadays, they all point to the sky, especially here over Europe. You have all these lanes of travel between cities. And if you look at any particular day, you'll see miles and miles of trails. And that's due to several different things. Flying at different altitudes, the different development of the engines that we have now, fan versus turbojet engines. And so these differences between the hot air that comes out of the engine exhaust and mixing with the temperature of minus 45 Celsius at altitude creates a water vapor, ice vapor, behind the engine. And they extend further and further now due to the different type of altitudes and technologies we use. But I can tell you, having flown 50 different models of airplanes, we don't have extra tanks. There's no room for them. We're lucky if we can get you and your baggage on the airplane. There's no vehicles for opening valves and dumping stuff out of the sky. Anything over 250,000 pounds has a dump valve. Anything smaller does not, and that's to dump fuel. And in an emergency, when we have to dump fuel, that fuel comes out, and the winds are going many, many kilometers per hour, sometimes 100, 200 kilometers an hour in opposite directions. So when you dump fuel, that fuel vaporizes, mixes with the traveling air of you going 400, the wind going 200, and not a single drop gets to the ground. None. It is entirely vaporized. So if I'm going to control people, this is probably the dumbest way to do it. because it's not effectual at all. But the accusation is all it takes to drive people crazy, thinking, well, they're going to try to control you. It's much easier to control you through your telephone, or if you really want to know control, here it is. Everything you say and do, everywhere you go, everything you buy, is easily tracked. So I don't think we need to be paranoid, we just need to be cognizant of what is going on. Let's see what else we were talking about. About 60% these days of the type of crafts that are seen are our own. I live in Southern California. There's many military bases. There are many military operations areas. And in there we have drones. We have different technologies that are being experimented with. Everybody heard about Area 51. They're not keeping any aliens there. There's no way you can hold them. But they do use technology on the basis of some stuff, regular aerodynamic things. But we are also experimenting with different technologies. And if you go out in the desert, you can witness some of these for ourselves. Triangular-shaped objects, any objects that has a landing gear sticking out, or fins, or any type of protrusion is ours, not extraterrestrial. Because they are not, you could not travel at the speeds and with the energy that is being used for electromagnetic propulsion with protrusions. This craft taps into the natural energy of the planet, which produces trillions of watts. And it travels from one spot to the other by frequency signature. Here's a picture from one of the spacecrafts of an instrument panel showing two planets and the waves of magnetic force that come from both planets. So let's say you're traveling from this one to this one. You're tuning in the frequency, just like a radio, let's say 100 megahertz. You travel outbound on those waves of energy until you intercept the lanes from the inbound and travel through that. This allows you to travel at the speed of magnetism, which is twice the speed of light. Now everybody said, oh my God, oh my God. You know, Einstein's theory about the speed of light, and yet we have found out that theory is just that, theory. Because we have recognized that we have subatomic particles that rotate around the atom that go faster than the speed of light. This is scientific fact. Printed for you to look and see. Look it up. So obviously, there are not issues with time travel and many of the other things that we theorize about. And so when we're looking at the distances of traveling space at the speed of magnetism, the distance from the Earth to the Moon, what's that, 249,000 miles? That's what? 0.6 of a second. Right? And so that brings me to another point. The technology, if you could bring up the star cluster, the technology that is required to travel space is thousands of years beyond our capability right now. When you leave this planet and you go far enough, you're surrounded like a cube, three-dimensionally, by this kind of a star field. Would you know which planet is Earth here? You do if you know its frequency. Just like you have a fingerprint, or each of you have a frequency unique to yourself. Everything that is composite in life has its own frequency. That's part of our, we are two things, chemistry and electricity, when electricity is frequency. Ask any biologist, they'll tell you. And so, we need to give a little bit more thought and credit to those who travel the reaches of space. Because it's not easy. It is dangerous. It's not science fiction. Beam me up, Scotty, warp speed. These are all things that we imagine in our brains and we have been submitted to through television and media and everything else. So when you think that somebody travels the reaches of space, or within your solar system, which is just as far in some circumstances compared, let's give them credit for what they have attained. And we also have to recognize, just like you and I sit in this room today, we're not running around with a bone in our hands, slapping each other over the head like cavemen, and then going into our cave and playing with our desktop. But that is exactly what this field of UFO people have projected upon you. That they're going to come from distances of space with such great technology that they're going to come and swipe you, do nasty things to you, examine you, implant you, impregnate you. All of this is nonsense. Absolute garbage. That technology allows them to sit in their craft in space right now, record every one of your thoughts, and all of your functions down to the molecules and atoms within it. Why do I need to come down here like a chicken and chase you around the barnyard in order to see what you're like? I'm not going to get any decent information from that anyway. That's not going to get you anywhere. So give them a little credit. They're not stealing your cows either. They're not. We do this kind of stuff. If you look at our laboratories in the United States alone, biochemical laboratories, Murtac, the other one in Colorado, we do the most horrific things to our own animals and people too, if we can get away with it. Yeah. All right? 1967 started around that area. My father was on the television, and they asked him about cattle mutilations. He said, nothing to do with extraterrestrials. That's our people. So the television producer says, I know one of the ranchers in Colorado. Let's call him. Call him up. The rancher says, there's no extraterrestrials here. I got Air Force personnel. I got laboratory people in their smocks walking around. They're experimenting with masers, which was the precursor to lasers, experimenting with viruses, like we are familiar with flesh-eating viruses, Ebola and other things. These things are done upon the animals that are out in the system, and they not necessarily catch them and take them back to the lab. That was the beginning of that. But they tried to convince you that somebody's grabbing your cows. And then when you didn't quite buy the cows, then we started grabbing people. And so, let's be critical. I expect you all to be critical of me. And when it comes to answering questions, fire away when that time comes. I will tell you what I know, and if I don't know, I'll tell you, sorry, I don't know. I'm not going to make it up. Because one thing I've learned in this field for over 50 years, when you stand in front of people, you have a responsibility. And that responsibility means not only to you, but to my own self.
True.
And I'm not going to lie, because I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm here to provide you information. You have to convince yourself, not me. Because you will have to go out there and get the material and research the material in order so that you can understand this subject. I can only hope to be a good representative. And like a teacher who stands in front of a group of brand new students, you know, here at home they call this elementary school or first grade. They're all 6 years old, they're all cute, they all sit there, they're looking at you, and they look at you with the respect and the trust that you will not lead them astray, that you will not cause them harm. And when you stand in front of people in this field, you better respect those same principles. And that's what I find lacking in the UFO field today. People who will say anything about everything and have no backup on any of it. And they market it and stuff their pockets full of money. I think you deserve more than that. And like George used to say, if you don't know, shut the hell up. And I got to agree with him. So, for those who dislike George, let me remind you. Photographs inspected, negatives and affidavits, photographic laboratories. Hollywood people have looked at that, the special effects people. He talked about space, the firefly effect, the atmosphere around the moon, conditions on other planets. And as we have gone decade through decade, these revelations have come about. It's not like he was some prophet. He wasn't Jesus walking amongst you. He was simply giving you information that was coming from our own space visitors. And one of the greatest pieces of information is the geophysical change that's happening on our world. It's not only on our world, it's in our solar system. Now, we call that global warming. That is a misnomer, a misidentifier, because it leads people to believe that the entire planet becomes warm at the same time. And that's not what happens. If you look at the geophysics of our world and meteorology, which I can tell you I know a fair amount about, having spent so many years flying airplanes, and it's a required subject in my profession, that the areas that are warm are cooling, and the ones that are cold are getting warmer. This changes the pattern in our planet. Our weather patterns are changing. Our rainfall is changing. The shifting of the pole has already occurred and continues to be in flux. We are going through a natural cycle. The planet has a 26,000-year cycle. The sun has an 11,000-year cycle. And when they coincide, then we start to get conditions that are more aggravated than we are previously used to. And do we contribute it? Yes. We're not the cause, but we are contributors to it. Because the planet and all of nature works on an equilibrium. For every effect, there's an equal and opposite effect. We know the Newtonian laws. So, as the planet struggles to go through its own natural geophysical change, we exasperate the tilting of the scale, so to speak, by adding pieces to the end of it. Overpopulation. If you want to know what is the greatest threat to your world, overpopulation. Irresponsible overpopulation. Which means overconsumption. Which means overproduction of waste. And so we are continuing to push those balances further and further, and the planet reacts. You have more earthquakes along the tectonic rims, the Asian area. In fact, we just had 3 of them yesterday. 3 6.5s, 6.8, 6.5, and an after, 6.4. And if you look around the globe, you will see that things are in flux. The volcano in Hawaii, which I fly over frequently. So the planet is going through its change, so is the solar system. So it behooves us to, 1, support a vigorous space program. That is your saving grace. For every dollar that's spent in space, there's a $4 return. Better than any stock market portfolio that you can ever come up with. And that's also Hugh Downs, the Rand Corporation, released that study. And so a space program is vital. It tells you your atmosphere. It tells you the storms that come. It tells you things about geophysics about your planet that makes your life more safe. That going further into space will eventually expose that is what is being withheld from you now. So for instance, in about 10 years ago, the Americans said, we've got water on the moon. But I can show you the documentations right here. In 1971, Apollo's instrumentations recorded geysers of water spraying out of the lunar surface for 14 hours. Now you think to yourself, well, we knew that in 1971. Why is it now 40 years later that we're going to tell you the same thing again? Because you're getting the same information slowly fed to you at a very snail pace. So you don't question. So you don't challenge. So you don't put 2 and 2 together. So this is some of the revelations that I've come across dealing in the circles that I have. In 1996, a gentleman from the Air Force Observatory in Hawaii wrote, and he had read the book Alien Bases on the Moon, and he said, I'm a photographer for the Air Force facility, And if you would like to come up to this facility, which is a privilege because it's controlled by the Department of Defense, we will get you clearance, and I will show you some pictures. So my mother and I got our DOD clearance. They already knew about us since the 60s. The Pentagon has a file this thick on my family. Like a New York phone book. My father looked at it and he laughed. He laughed, oh boy, well, I guess you boys keep busy. And up we went there, and then they showed us some photographs of the type of technology, not only from ground base to the shuttle, but also from the shuttle back down. And desensitized pictures would still, from space, be able to take a photograph of you standing on the street holding this in your hand and determine with clarity what that was in your hand. In this case, it was a pack of cigarettes. And so he said, we have unidentified flying objects, and we have identified ones, which we know where they are. And I don't think that anybody, no matter how skeptical you are, could possibly question the amount of astronauts that have spoken. Gordon Cooper spoke openly on nationwide television with Merv Griffin that he had seen these craft and encountered their human occupants. If you look at Maurice Chatelain's book, who owns the telecommunications patents for all of the Apollo missions, he categorically lists all the missions and all the astronauts and all the UFOs that accompanied them in space and to and from the moon. You have the other astronauts like White and many others, Young, who have outspoken about what they saw as well. Not everybody. Armstrong didn't speak, but he was changed for his entire life. His whole demeanor, his whole personality was much affected by his time on the moon. And so these are the type of officials who have come straight out open and admitted to the fact. You can find many of them. I carry them along the archives as well. Gemini to take photographs of them, and we'll see some photographs that are published by the Look magazine and True and the other magazines that were available during those times, in which they openly state this. And so they don't have any reason to lie to you. They're telling you, hey, wake up. It's time to wake up. And so, anyhow, why don't we take a look at the film, and we'll turn the lights down. Let me get my laser pointer. This is a composite of motion picture films. These are called high flyers, that you can see them during the night and day. And you see them here, flying along adjacent to the rooftops. And through the day sky, moving along. This is with the ionized film around the craft. And the faster the craft goes, the bigger the field is. It's not only a byproduct of the propulsion, but a protection system from space debris and what have you as they travel through space. So we put here some of the small clips together just to give you an idea. It looks like a pearl during the daytime. At the night, it's multi-luminous as it moves along. And they can go in singular. They can fly in formation, which you will see also. And they move about, not just always linear. They go around in circles around each other sometimes. I took friends many years ago while I was in university. We went up to the top of Mount Palomar, which is very close to where I live. As you can see, 3 of them. And they go behind the lines and are rotating around each other. And we went up there one evening, and many of them didn't have any idea. I don't broadcast always what I do. And we sat down one night up there, and we were able to see about 20. But that was just pure luck. It had nothing to do with me. It's by sitting in the right place at the right time. If I want to see airplanes, I go sit at the airport. If I want to see UFOs, I wait till an hour and a half after sunset, and I position myself somewhere where the sky is clear. And sometimes you see them, and sometimes you don't. There you go. These are also described in the Bible as the doves. If you look at the Hebrew, who are these who fly like doves? Back to the The rest of the quotation I can't tell you off the top of my head because my brain is small. And this is Mexico in 1958. They're driving along outside the Chapala region of Guadalajara. And in the distance, you see something right here. And we've stilled it so that you got yourself a better view. I'd like to thank Renee Olson in the back of the room for his work that he's done with us in order to make this more legible and easier for you to see as part of the motion picture. He's done excellent work. You can see the translucence of the craft, the pole running through from north to south. And then as you get closer, here's a set of trees, and as the camera pans up, you'll see two things. One, a registering disc moving here, but look here on the top of the still. Here you start to see the rest of the craft start to come fully visible. This film, along with others, we took to ABC in 1967. And in the studio up above were the three ABC producers and a group of military people. And they confiscated the film. Took my father 4 months with legal attorneys to get this film back. And when it got back, a portion of this film is cut. But you can still see the rest of the craft. And as that film continued, that entire craft became fully visible. And that's because they are using a device that bends light rays. And they carry it on their persona as well as protection. You can see it here. And all it does is using the unified field theory is that by bending light rays, I can't see you, but you are still there, very much visible. And you can touch them. They're not going into another dimension and all of this other stuff. I've seen that device also demonstrated. Here's one of the pictures that I have in my notebook, and I recently released, and you can see the mothership, but you can see also a series of other crafts around it. This is taken over Mount Palomar. Here's the edge of the mothership here as well. This is a piece of film that was taken over the Vista area, George's old home, and as you see it moves across the sky above the power lines and then disappears in the distance. These are the old days of 8 and 16 millimeter cameras. And so it's not like everybody today who carries around pictures on their cell phones. Also, long before computers existed. This is a new ship. This is the replacement of that scout ship. This is allowed to carry a small crew interplanetarily without the mothership, without the carrier craft. This is a Model T Ford in comparison to what that is. Their technology goes on as well. This is the Wisconsin footage in which they are demonstrating the maneuverability of the crafts. Watch how that craft not only comes towards you and backwards, but then goes side to side and dips into the terrain as well. The skeptics weren't stupid enough to try to challenge this kind of film. Not only one, but eventually a second one came along as well and maneuvered around. You can see the cars driving along the freeway. These are the same type of craft that appeared in formation in 1952 in July over Washington, D.C., in which we scrambled shooting star jets to try to intercept them and could not catch them. Over every major capital around the world. Now there is a series of Silver Springs There are several different pieces of it. One of them is the registering disc, coming and measuring the distance between the trees and the ground, because later on the larger craft would come and maneuver as well. And you can see there's a section of that where we still framed it, where the craft is behind the tree. So that takes that accusation out of play. Registering disc is what we would consider a drone. They come in different sizes. I've seen them about so big, up to about 12 feet long. And they come in and collect data. It's like a probe. Now, I know everybody likes to see stuff up close and what have you, but I would say in civilian hands, for authentication purposes, these are some of the best, as Colonel Freeman said. At that time, too, you have to admit, say in 1960s. And as you can see by the still frame, it goes behind the tree branch. During this entire period in Silver Springs, the CIA had a car parked at the bottom of the driveway. My father and I would walk down there. He said, "Come on, Glenn, let's go give them some coffee," because they're sitting out there all night by themselves. This is the start of the Silver Springs film, in which there's only a small surviving part. And this is also a copy of a copy. So the more copies you made, and you've seen it on YouTube as well, the flatter the image becomes. But when you look at the still frames of that film, you see something entirely different. So it retracted one of the 3 balls condensers as it moved about. Bill Sherwood from Kodak camera estimated the distance about 100 feet from the lens. And now when you look at the still shots, you can see the 3-dimensionality, the portholes. The change in the hull proves it's not a model, because a model doesn't change. And this comes from the low-level radiation field that emits through the pores, like it would come through your skin, out through the craft. And if you park your car on a hot summer day, this is a painting that was done by one of George's space contacts. The spaceman painted it beautifully, translucent as it is. ABC came. My father filmed this of ABC when they came after the film was taken, and they did a very thorough a report on that. But going back to the craft, when you take your car on a hot summer day and you park it a couple hundred yards away, it doesn't look like your car at all, because of the radiation or refraction that's happening off the top of the car. It changes the shape of not the bed, but in your eye you see the differential. So what we have done is we took some of the private films that I found in archives. This is Mrs. Rotifer here. And came across them. I've gone through the vaults and slowly collected material. I've got negatives that I have to go through that I will do with Renee. There's my mother up there in the window. And continue to produce and give you as much information as possible. I think in this UFO field, if you see the type of hateful, scary, monstrous stories you hear, then how can George be so far-fetched on the other side when he tells you that you have human beings that have a little bit better nature and heart and wishing to help you? What makes that so ridiculous compared to what you hear today? I think what you hear today is absolutely ridiculous. These are some of the things I've included in here simply to show people that, like everyone else that worked in this field, we're just regular people. I have a job, I go to work, I earn money, I pay my bills, and I work in this program because I was been so fortunate to be included in it that I cannot imagine just walking away from it and letting it be. These are the people that were there on the Mount Palomar property. Recently, a few years ago, A fellow by the name of Alan Tolan, who was a retired aerospace engineer, worked for the Department of Defense. He witnessed this saucer touch down on George's property in 1957. He's gone on record. He holds a patent for electromagnetic separation between objects. You can Google him if you like. He's in his later stages of life now. He's given me all his files and the ability to use that. And he saw the craft touch down, but more importantly, the government came to him and asked him about what space contacts that he had with George. And Alan actually brought one of them with him. And you tell him this doesn't exist, he laughs in your face. These are Mary Christina Reda, some of the co-workers, as you may know, remember Hans Peterson was the one here in Denmark, Dora Bauer in Germany, and a number of others. All these people I knew growing up as a kid, Ronald Caswell, Christina Reda, and I've gone to many of these countries. A small piece of film found in one of the reels. We just threw it in here because it shows things. But some of the other ones, when he was on this tour from New Zealand to Australia, you can see 3 of the ships flying below the Viscount. And because they were always with him, they always gave him support. Because in this world, God knows you need it. So this property now is owned by a group of investors. And they have a campground, an RV ground there, and we have a display that's there. And we have a loose agreement between us that allows some of the promotion for this to go along. And for many decades, we had busloads of Japanese and many people from all over the world come by and visit. We would go up there as well as to the Desert Center with the contact of November 20th, 1952, in which we have the footprints and the photographs from, and the newspaper articles that were reported in the local newspapers of this particular event. So when next time you pick up an article and says, "Where's the aliens?" it's very simple. They've been here a long time. Look at these antique cars. I'll bet any one of us wish we had one of those now. We'd be millionaires. Like I said before, George gave away his pictures, many of the contracts to print the books, whether it was here in Denmark or Sweden or wherever, were all given without royalties. This is in New Zealand. George wasn't out to make money. He never made any money off of it. When he passed away, his estate was worth next to nothing. That's not what he was here in the purpose for. And he could have made a whole lot of money. I remember once the CIA came to my father, and the guy sat in our living room, and he said, "I will give you $1 million if you denounce George." And my father told him, "Kiss my hiney." Here you can see moving underneath the wing of the craft. There's a third one. I do not ridicule people who don't believe. Not at all. We all have to find our own evidence. That's Carl Feit, one of the co-workers. My father used to say he was the greatest skeptic, until George showed him not only the crafts, but the individuals who pilot them. And as a kid, I was fortunate enough to sit in the same room when 2 of these individuals came, that's Lord Desmond Leslie, who was a co-author of the Flying Saucers Have Landed. And George said to me, "Sit down, quiet, listen." And between the 3 of them, they determined where he needed to be the next time with his camera ready and ready to photograph. These are planned events. You're just not walking around with a 10-pound camera glued in your hand all over the planet. You have to know when you're getting ready to go and when they're coming. And like the Silver Spring footage, that ship, the first piece of it came across the trees, over the trees and in between maneuvered and then went right over the top of your head, and you could see the ring spinning underneath it. Hans Petersen, Ronald Caswell. So there was a unified effort in those days to get as much of this information out as possible. And it was well received. In Detroit, 5,000 people in the amphitheater. Mexico City, New Zealand, Australia. I have the Golden Medal of Honor from the Pope. George delivered as you can see, there I'm standing, a sealed message to Pope John the 23rd, in which the Pope gave them the medal, and I have that with me. Some people said it doesn't exist, some people said he bought it. All nonsense. The witnesses clearly saw he had the medal before it was released to the public. Once again, innuendo without fact, hoping that that will deter. That was in Amsterdam. That was Nettie Van Buren. Now, quickly from there. This is the article from the Washington Daily News where we were downtown where the ship was seen. That's my family with George in the Silver Springs house. That is in Linz in Austria where we had our little issue with Billy Meyer. That's 1968 in the newspaper in Washington. Here are the papers, because I carry facts, not fiction. The invitations from Colonel Freeman, from Dr. Lohman, and all the other documentation, the letter from Balmoral and Prince Philip. My father, House of Lords, was invited to speak with the book Alien Bases on the Moon. This is a 1966 film taken of a series of craft on the train from Mannheim. I'm holding the window down. As you know, in the trains here, they were triggered down, so hold the window down. And the whole row of people are standing along the side of the train as my father's filming these series of crafts that are behind the trees, behind the wires, flying alongside of the train. One reporter said it's one of the best pieces of film they've seen in Germany during that time. The reason I have to put this into the frame, unfortunately, people like to steal in this business and they have no ethics. .707 across the North Atlantic. Look at the mothership, look at the two ships here. We freeze-framed it and enlarged it, but you will see that as we move along, it goes behind the number 3 engine of the 707. Now this is from about 33,000 feet. So you can imagine the size of the craft, probably about 6,000 feet. These are the books from the astronauts. We were one of the first to bring these pictures out from Apollo because the scientists gave us the area where to order them. You can see the material pouring from this crater into this one, shoveling out. So there must be something in there pushing it along. Cigar-shaped craft, Lunar Orbiter 4, casting the shadow. Backside of the moon, look at how light that is, lighting up the whole dark side. Here you've got 2 set of tracks moving across the surface. Apollo 12 picture. Look at the Gassendi crater. Look at all the constructions inside Gassendi. Earthrise. Look at the atmosphere changing as the Earthrise comes up. Where the neutral gravity, or the L1 point is, at 44,000 miles. Look at the crater on the first orbit, and look at it here. Everything's moved to the north. That mist has moved to the north of that crater. That's one of the last pictures of my father before he passed away. We were at the conference together in '91. His first book, Why Are They Here?, in which he dealt with his contacts from George. A few allocated photos from New Mexico. Everybody's seen this one, many of them black and white. Gemini, Look magazine. Look at the octagonal shapes. Also, Gemini, separation of stage. These are just some of the stuff. One of the pictures printed from 1923. There's another one from 1918. And you know here that Lord Dowden, who was a sponsor along with Lord Mountbatten, for George Adamski in Britain, who firmly believed it. This I used as a diagram to show you a little bit of how the electromagnetics of the planet work. And the last book we just put out. So, let's take a break.
So looking for UFOs, that is 1 hour and 1.5 hours after
Usually about an hour and a half after sunset.
the sunset,
And then,
You can see sunlight.
and not before sunrise.
yes, also then about 4 in the morning, something around that, depending about what time sunrise. And this is simply the strengthening of the magnetic lanes. You can see them at other times as well.
Yeah.
But once again, there are many misconceptions in this UFO field. For instance, the craft slightly tadpoles. It never swings like a gyroscope like this. That means you got a string attached. These craft are solidly embedded within the magnetic lines of force. They can move like this, and like this, and like this, and upside down means no difference to them. Gravity is still pulling from the bottom up. Right? But they move, as they move around, and kind of the forces, the lines of force are kind of vibrating. So they move like this, sort of like, a tadpole before it becomes a frog, has a little tail and kind of swishes along like that. And it skips on the top of the ionosphere. And I know one fellow here and his wife have taken people out in the desert and said to them, look, 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 when I communicate with them, they flash on and on. Nonsense. It's because they're skipping on the top of the ionosphere, and as you skip over the top, the light increases and decreases. It has nothing to do with they recognizing you. If they want to recognize you, they come down and recognize you. Right? So once again, there's a lot of claims that people are using in order to sensationalize with the public. Say, oh, look who I am. No. And I once, during one of these UFO conferences, and they want nothing to do with George. I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I volunteered. I never charge. I never market or promote. I simply give the books there at cost the best I can. I donate my time, and I said to them, I'll come out there and I'll show the material, or at least show the film. 3 years in a row. Don't want anything to do with it. And this is the contact in the desert with the Van Tassel people out there. And because they are apprehensive of what I'm going to say. If somebody asks me a question and I know the truth, I will tell you. I'm not going to give you garbage. And they don't like that, because so much of this field is my God. I watched the other day one of these programs, and I won't mention names, but these two fellows, they had totally fabricated everything that came out of their mouth. And then they even had the audacity to try to lecture the people on the laws of karma. Now, if I'm going to sit here and tell you a bunch of lies, the first thing she'll be scared of karma is me, isn't it? Because I'm the one who's causing this to come about. But they have no compunction whatsoever. Nothing. And prove not a single statement out of their mouths. And I find that deplorable. So they know if they invite me, they ain't going to hear what they want to hear. So anyway, I went together with the historian who works in that area, and she was running tours out to the Van Tassel place, and then out to what's called Giant Rock. Now, there are some people who would like to believe that there's one big rock, and that's special. And I told her, I said, Barbara, I fly over millions of miles of this area, and there are bigger rocks than these anywhere you look. So nature and the creative force does not discriminate. It doesn't say that this rock is better than this rock, or this person is better than this person, or that female is better than that male, or this race is better than that. That is not God. God is not a personal God, it's a universal God. And so we went out there in the evening, and we sat down. There were about 65 of us, and we talked about the history of the place. And I told the people, I said, this is the area where you can see several things. One, we're on the arrival and departure areas for the large international airport. So we fly over that as we land miles away in Los Angeles. So you'll see airplanes. So sitting here, you're going to see the strobe lights, the blinking beacons, red and green. You'll know what an airplane looks like, even without the sound, that you're going to get sound too. And then one night we had the International Space Station fly by. Easy to see, easy to track, easy to look at. Then we looked at what we call the satellites. And I am so surprised when people are constantly looking in the sky and say, oh, well, that's a satellite. All right, tell me about satellites. How long does a satellite take to go from horizon to horizon? Almost 3 minutes. Anything that goes faster than that isn't a satellite. So on one evening there, we saw the space station, the airplanes, the satellites, and then we had a chance to see a couple of high flyers. And I told them, it ain't got nothing to do with me. I'm not anybody more or less special than anybody else. I said, we're putting ourselves in a position where we may see something. And if we do, fine. And that night we saw probably 15 high flyers. And of course they went crazy. Everybody went running back in the evening by 11 o'clock to the conference. The next morning, we looked and saw high flyers and this and that. So the next night they all came running out there. And we didn't see anything. Because it's circumstance. Right? And so anybody who tells you they can summon spaceships is full of it. They decide whom they come to, and they look very carefully. They examine and watch you carefully, because this type of events changes your life. And since they are well aware of what the law of karma is, and it's not the East Indian version of what we do to you, I have to fix to you. That's not how that works. If I do something negative to you, if I recognize it and I don't repeat it to the next person, I have nullified it. I do not have to chase you for lifetimes and lifetimes in order to fix it. That's garbage. Right? So they are well aware of what the law of karma means. And they know that they are going to respect it. Bottom line is, they are 4,000 years ahead of you in thinking and in recognition. Here we have to fight against everything. You go to school, they tell you one thing. You go to the next class, they tell you another thing. When I went to university, they told me everything I learned in high school was garbage. We're going to tell you something else now. And I said to them, why did I spend the last 18 years learning garbage? They don't do that. From the point of conception, the children are recognized, not only by their parents, by everybody around them. The communication, while we go inside the kids thinking, what the hell are you talking about? Right? You're communicating with an intelligence that just came from the next form. One moment, please. And so they are raised in a condition where there are no secrets. And where truth is, if you want to know if this is true, you go there and find out. It's not hidden from you. This is a type of life that most people cannot even conceive. That is true freedom. We just give freedom lip service. It's a word, but we really don't live it or believe it. And this is the type of humanity they represent. Yes, you were going to ask something.
Yes, you're telling us how life could be, and I agree totally with you. And I can conceive of it, I can tell you. So, what is going on here? Why is this charade going on Earth with all these lies, with all this?
You know why? Let's look at it as very base. We have a dichotomy, or what we call a division within ourselves. This division is mind, and the other half is consciousness. Mind is our own character, our own self-determination. What do I want? What satisfies me? What satiates me? And the other half of consciousness or creative force is your inner intuition. All of you have had intuition where you say, you know, I'm not going to go this way today, I'll go this way. And lo and behold, there's a huge accident, and you may have been involved in it. That's just a basic example. But that intuition, that tie to universal creative force, is throughout the cosmos. Now there is a battle within us between what I want and what I should do. My will be done or thy will be done. And in most cases, we live in a world where it's my will be done. on this planet Earth, which is just merely one classroom, in an infinite scale of both higher and lower. You had to come from somewhere and you got to go somewhere. This is just one small classroom in which we live primarily by the mind. We don't care about consequences. We try to remove ourselves from as much responsibility and ownership as possible. If you do something, stand up for it. Why wouldn't you? For every time you support the principles that create a better you, you have added to that creative force. And so what's happening on this world, we are 99% mind. And we rush about irresponsible of anything. And so our leaders are 99% mind too. They're not any different than you and I. If, as George used to say, if you want to see a cross-section of the population, look to their leaders. And you will see, because we put them in that place. And most of us would change places with them in a heartbeat and do the same thing they do, because we want the privilege or the power or the wealth. And so we cannot point the fingers at everybody else until we stand in front of the mirror yourself. Whether it's Jesus or the Oracle of Delphi or the Egyptian books that said, "Know thyself and you shall know all things." Well, how many people spend any time knowing themselves? And if you know yourself, then you no longer can worry about who is manipulating you, because you recognize it like that. Is this my thought? Does this come from my character, or is it coming from the rest of the people in the group? Or is it being broadcast to me mechanically, either through satellites or through, we have microwave weapons and things like this that we can broadcast through. Mind-controlled thoughts that cause lost time, unconsciousness, scratching, and inflammation of the skin. All the stuff we attribute to extraterrestrials, we're the ones who are doing it. But if you know yourself, then no one can manipulate you. If somebody brings me a sandwich that's garbage and a nice ham sandwich and say, "Glenn, what are you going to take?" I'm not eating a garbage sandwich, I guarantee you. So the work starts with you, each and every one of you. This is where it begins. And that's what people do not like to hear in this UFO field, and mostly in the New Age field, because they want to be known that they are taken care of, that they don't have to do anything. Look at the Roman Catholic Church. It sits on a wealth of information, and I could divulge all kinds of stuff about that we need not go into. But they do know about extraterrestrials because George delivered the message. And he got the gold medal for it. Right? So they're not stupid, but they are dealing with their flock. My father once said to a minister, he said, "Why do you lie to the people?" And the minister said, "I give them what they want. If they want comfort, I give them comfort. If they want absolution because they act, look at all the mob, organized crime people. They kill each other 6 days out of the week. They go to the Catholic Church on the 7th, put thousands of dollars in the pot. Padre goes, Spirito Santo Santo, you're absolved, and next day start killing people again. This is the world we create. Decide if you want to be part of it. Personally, I'm not too thrilled with it. But they're not giving me a choice. If I could get out of here, trust me, I would. Yes?
What about Billy Meyer?
You tell me what you think about Billy Meyer.
I think he's a good guy.
Okay, then you don't need my opinion. I can only tell you this. That picture in Linz in 1967, Egbert Wilpertz was a Spiegel editor, set up a lecture. And during this lecture, this gentleman in the back of the room started causing a great deal of ruckus and mayhem and disruption. And so we stopped the lecture, and Wilberts went up to him, and my father as well, and this fellow introduced himself as Billy Meyer. And he started ranting and raving and screaming about battling aliens in the caves of Switzerland with one hand and one arm and what have you. And so I think we gave him his due diligence, and that was that. So, anyone else? Yes? Yes?
What's your opinion about the Amnesty case in Italy and Southern Europe?
Well, to tell you the truth, I cannot, out of my brain right now, pull that case out of my mind. Like I said, I come across so much material, and I just simply don't remember it all. I know that there was originally a case in '59 in Italy in which one of these craft landed, and a fellow in a spacesuit actually came out, looked very much like an Apollo astronaut, and so that may have done to the compression differentials between atmospheres to a certain extent. As far as what you're referring to, you'd have to educate me. I don't know.
It's a friendship case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know the particulars at the moment.
It's a whole village that, not a whole, a lot of people from one village who had contact with these beings that were living in an underwater base and
Well, I know their basis. In 1968, before George passed away in '65, he showed us on the map where there was a base in Mexico. And so my father bought a piece of property very close to this mountain base, and for 3 years we lived there. And we had the opportunity to see a number of ships fly into the mountain base and fly around the area. 3 days after we moved into the property, the Mexican military police showed up with 2 caravans of soldiers. And the commandant came to the door, and yeah, I'd like to come in. Okay, my father was always friendly. He dealt with all these officials all his life. It was no big deal to him. He was not intimidated by anything. And so the commandant said, I have to deploy my troops around the ranch, about 45 hectares rather, and we're going to use electrometers, and we're going to look for stuff. And well, I said, be my guest. And so they all went looking. And in the meantime, the commandant stood in the living room, which is about twice the size of this hallway, and we had a number of George's pictures hanging on the wall. And my father said, you know, this makes me rather happy. He says, because obviously you wouldn't come out here and waste your time if you didn't think there was something worth looking for. My father said to him, he said, don't worry, you won't find a spaceship, because if I had one, I'd have gotten the hell out of here a long time ago. And so the commandant pointed to the picture and he says, we know they're here, we know they're good for us, but we don't want them. And so he said, we have received a briefing from the Pentagon, and we know about your activities, and you will be allowed to stay as long as you do not go among the general population and lecture to them. Otherwise, we deport you. And so my father said, no worries, because George had other co-workers in Mexico during that time that were high up in the official region, like Christina Reda you saw in the picture, and she took care of allowing for lectures and things like that under her umbrella versus us. And so after watching some of these craft disappear into the mountain, my father said, let's go, and we all loaded up in a Jeep, about 6 or 7 of us, and drove up into the high mountains. And George described the road going up there and the village that's the end of the road at the base of the mountain. And then you would have to walk 24 hours through the woods and the mountains to get to that base. But there was a small village, probably about 100 people living there. And so we stopped. That was the end of the road. And so we got out of the car, and they all looked at us rather strange. And so we said to them, why do you look at us so funny? And he said, and so the spokesman for the village says, well, we have seen men and women, fair-skinned like you, dressed up in suits, come out of the forest, walk down the road to the main highway, wait for the bus, and go. But we've never seen anyone come back. So they looked at us rather peculiarly, And so, no, we didn't go to the base. We weren't invited, and we honor that, their restrictions and their rules, and don't question them, because they're a little bit smarter than the rest of us. And so, but the bases, I am aware of some of them like that. I know they have some bases in the water as well. These are not bases that they are spending a long time in. In other words, these are temporary places. And the reason that they're in their oceans and they go in there with these large craft is they are going along the fault lines. Whether it's out the Marianas Trench or the one in Puerto Rico, these fault lines border the mantle rims of the planet. and they are watching our planet very carefully to see its rate of deterioration. To put it plainly, the solar system is deteriorating, and they are in the process of transporting their people off their planets to the next solar system of Alpha Centauri, in which is inhabitable. It has come to that point. There are about 200,000 Earth people who have volunteered. They ain't taken, they're not kidnapped, they're not abducted. They have volunteered to go. And they have gone through a screening process in which they have done what they needed to do here, and so they are free to go and do that. So they are not so unsympathetic as to leave us to our own accord. And they have made a statement. If it ever comes to a time where we have a cataclysmic events and the change in the geophysics of our world, they will come with their ships, whatever they have to spare, and they will land and open the door. There will be no invitations. There will be nobody waving there with a hand, nobody broadcasting, welcome, welcome, come, come, come. They will simply open the doors. And only those who have the recognition and the peace within them to not be fearful and walk in on their own accord will be the ones that leave. That will be less than 1% of the population of this planet. But that's our own choice. You either get over your own fear or you suffer the consequences of the life of fear. Just a moment. Anyone else? No? Then again, go ahead.
You mentioned that there was written on 2 pieces of paper the number of aliens amongst us.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the relation between man-made and extraterrestrial crafts?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I started to talk about it. About 65% these days is our own research and development. As I said, triangular appendages, fins, these sort of things. I'd say about another 10% is straight misidentification. Right? So, for instance, I can tell you, so many times in UFO groups, I've seen somebody take a picture of the clouds over a mountain range that look lenticular or like a bean. And we call those standing lenticular clouds are representative of high turbulence, in which the wind shear zone from which direction encounters a separate direction. It is not only a cautionary site for us as pilots to stay away from, but it creates long lenticular clouds that sometimes can stack like pancakes above the mountains. And of course, when people who are, they are, shall we say, wishful thinking, take these pictures, they claim this is, of course, UFOs and what have you. And so there are atmospheric phenomena, we need to be honest. Roll lightning from cloud to cloud, which causes plasma balls, which is very much what has been described during World War II with the green plasma balls flying alongside the Allied bomber squadrons and things like that. In this case, those were registering disks. But there is a phenomena that causes a plasma ball as well. And so we need to be honest about representation. So that gets us to 75%, right? And then there are other things that are just misidentified. I've seen stars during the day that have been over-zoomed. Well, for instance, as you fly at night, the atmosphere, of course, is thicker, closer, lower down. So as you fly and you see Venus and Jupiter come above the horizon, as they first come above the horizon, they're the size of a marble and sparkling and all kinds of things like this. And so you have to realize you wait 30 minutes until it rises, the apex climbs higher in the horizon, then you can clearly identify what it is and isn't. Some things are extraterrestrial craft. I was flying one evening, 10-hour trip to Buenos Aires along the eastern flank of the Brazilian jungle, and which for certain periods of time, once you pass Quito in Ecuador, along that rim until you get around to Cordoba in Argentina, there isn't a light to be seen. The whole basin of the Amazon jungle is as dark as you can, anything. And out of the jungle, I watched one of these craft come, light up the whole area, come out of the jungle, come up along the mountain ridge, and then go off into space. And then one, I've only seen it a few times flying, Another time I was very far north, up towards Goose Bay. Just a moment. Yes, okay, Goose Bay. We need to change quickly the camera.
No, not yet.
Well, we're good? Okay, just a moment. Goose Bay, and which is far up north towards the middle as you cross the North Atlantic to Greenland, and the moon was a crescent moon. And I'm sitting there, and I'm watching from behind the moon this large orb come around. So I say to the other two guys, look, 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 what the heck is that? And they look out there, and we watch this thing go across the face of the moon, go around the other side, and then go up into space. And so I waited for them to make a comment, and they didn't comment, and we left it as it was. Because of my profession, you know, you have to recognize the restrictions. You have a question?
Yeah, about that. As an airline pilot, what is the procedure if you spot something?
Procedure is,
unidentified? What are you
yes,
told?
it's purely voluntary. So, for instance, if you decide to report that, then it goes into a report in which the Federal Aviation Administration may or may not respond. For instance, over the southwestern United States, I think it was last year, there were a couple of airline crews that noticed something that was, we have a radar device called TCAS, a Terminal Collision Avoidance System, in which every airplane has its own code, transponder code, and that paints on our screen so we don't have collisions. So you can see the altitude and the speed upon which they are separated and going the directions. And so one Southwest crew, I believe it was, reported that they saw an object. So they called up air traffic control and said, do you have a target at this and this position? And the air traffic controller says, no, I have no target there. And then another airline, I believe it was American, their pilots came on and says, yeah, we're showing a target over there as well. And the air traffic control was not painting it on their radar. And so, in the old days, a lot of air traffic controllers would record these, and of course everything is taped. And the problem was that when you divulged or filled out the report, the first thing you were done was taken in for psychological evaluation. So there was a whole series of tests that they would inconvenience you with. So to a great extent these days, most people they look at it and they say, okay, what have you, and they keep going. They don't want to be bothered. Unlike the JAL crew, which you might be familiar with many years ago, the 747 over Alaska, the foreign carriers aren't necessarily subjected to the same type of criticism and regulation. So, in other words, if let's say Lufthansa crew or something sees something over America, they cannot be pulled in by the FAA. They are guarded by their own people.
But the Japanese pilot, he stopped flying. He was grounded because of that.
Well, yeah, it depends on how much you're willing to fight it. The thing in that particular circumstance is the passengers also saw it, and I think somebody had some photographs. And so, how close was he with the retirement and all this other thing? Sometimes you think it's not worth the issue. I have excellent lawyers. And if they ever gave me any trouble, I would give them a court case that would be on every television station across America. And they know that I'm looking for any chance to retire with a lot more money than I have now, and they're just not giving me that chance. So, you know, that's, but...
cultural thing also in Japan when it comes, you don't question authority in Japan.
Well, that's absolutely true. But, I mean, I've seen some very good pictures from China and from Russia. And in fact, as I was going to mention earlier, in '89, the wall had come down. And my father and I were in a conference in Frankfurt, a very large one. And 3 Soviet scientists came to us and said, we would like to talk. Well, of course, who turns that down? So we put everything away, go to talk. And one of the things that was discussed was just about, a couple months before, TASS, which was still the official Soviet news representation and very carefully monitored, released a story about one of these craft landing in the steppes of Russia in an old abandoned air base. And the Russians were very straightforward. They said, we leave these facilities open for them to land, and it's not unusual that they do. In fact, there was a standing order that they should never be shot at. And one Russian general violated that rule, and within a week he was out of a job. He was gone. And so this craft landed, and it described the people coming out. People came out, they walked into the village, the villagers were aware, they'd seen them before the craft. They went in there and drank some water, what have you. And so the description was of normal people. By the time that story got from Russia to Western Europe, these occupants now were 8 feet tall and had multiple eyes. By the time that went from Western Europe to the United States, they had 8 feet tall, multiple eyes, and multiple arms like an octopus. Right? And so he said, that is how this is twisted, to make it as ridiculous as possible. Oh, when was it? About 10 years ago? Maybe it wasn't even that long. I was in Israel. And they had that sighting that supposedly came out down on the Dome of the Rock. And I said to a lot of the UFO people, I said, wait, do not jump to conclusions too soon. Get all the facts and information first. Well, of course, they don't listen. They want to be the first one, blah, 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 the talking heads. And so eventually the article made its way into the Tel Aviv paper. But as you went through this paper, on about the 23rd page was a little article about this sighting over Jerusalem, and directly underneath it was a big article about a mermaid being seen in the Mediterranean. Right? And everybody laughs, but think about the psychology that's associated with that. Anybody who picks it up and reads it, it's right away in tandem with something else. And so people will look at, oh, mermaids, UFOs, okay, next thing. You know, they have other things to think about. And so I remember my father had a very good friend, a newspaper editor in Washington, and at that days we had teletype. The stories used to come, tack, 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 UPI and other stuff. And there was a report of 3 students being picked up and flown around the moons of Saturn. And the guy tore it off the teletype and handed it to my father and says, you keep it, I can't print this. I am told what I can and cannot print. There is no such thing as a free press. There's free sensationalism. There's a whole lot of free garbage, but there's not a free press. Anyone else? No? Yes? Yeah? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you are piloting an airplane or even as a passenger, then you get a little bit angry that you actually are aboard a ship that consumes kerosene as a fuel instead of something.
I'm more angry about not being first class where I can stretch out and sleep. But no, I mean, think about the technology, even though it's old. I mean, basically, the jet design came out in the 50s. The French Caravelle, the 707. A lot of this technology is developed only from the 50s and just fine-tuned. We still fly at the same altitudes, at the same speeds. We just use a little less gas because of the technology of the engines. But still, if you think about it, you get in an airplane and 7 hours later you're on the other side of the planet. You had a meal, you watched a movie. It's not too bad, considering what it used to be 3 years in a boat, or going by wagon train pulled by an ox across the plateau. So we live in good times. I mean, truly, we have technology that makes our life easier. Our knowledge of medicine has helped. We have not given all our knowledge of medicine to help all of us, but to a certain degree, we are living in good times. As the geneticists say, you are capable right now of living at least over 200 years in this form, provided you take care of it. But we don't. I remember George went on a panel, and there was a doctor and some other people, and he said, stress is one of the greatest causes of cancer and disease. Oh, and they laughed at him and ridiculed him and called him names. Now we know 50 years later, stress is one of the greatest causes of cancer and disease because it puts our bodies in an unnatural state, and that unnatural state starts to mutate our cells and molecules, and sooner or later, there we are. Now, of course, this is not to include the outside influences, atmosphere, what we dump into it, and what we do to ourselves, but to a greatest extent, we are the ones who are tearing about our own body because we don't want to give it what it wants, we want to give it what we want. And that's difficult, yes.
Can I just read the questions? I have 3 questions. What was the number written on that piece of paper they both wrote and changed? Why is there no disclosure of these alien technologies so we can skip kerosene burning? And what's going on Antarctica?
The number on the piece of paper was several 100,000 at that point. Remember that this is not any different than the amount of people that travel from Europe to America on holiday on any given time, or travel anywhere on this planet. Let's just ballpark and say 200,000. That's a very small percentage of people at any given time, any place. I mean, we have 40,000 illegal immigrants coming across our borders every month in the United States, so these are really not very large numbers. Disclosure doesn't happen and will never happen, and that's very simply why. Because you have been told something for so long, and upon that lie, we have built more and more and more. And the people who build those lies, some of them are still alive, or they have handed it off to the next group of people who are part of that same infrastructure. And so if the government would come openly and say to you, we're going to tell you the truth now, they have dealt it with skepticism for so long, the first thing you're going to think is, well, they haven't told us the truth before, so how can we trust what they're going to tell us now? We have created our own little hideous monster there. But more than that, in this UFO field is where the greatest resistance lies. Because so many have taken their personal agendas and mixed it like a stew into the UFO field that they are each fighting diligently for their domination. And none of them want to give it up. Right? And so the truth means nothing to them. They want to live their fantasy. And there are plenty of them. There will be other people who wish to do that. So the only way that a disclosure from the standpoint of more realization would come is if they would openly come and land. But that also has severe repercussions as well. The first thing we do is we take our tanks and guns and shoot at them and try to kill them, which will mean nothing, but still it is the aggressive factor. And we have proven long ago that we only unite when there's something to fight. And that's a sad state of reality.
What about Stephen Greer's project?
I believe that Mr. Greer started with a great deal of hope and desire to make a change, which fell flat on its face. Because if you had spent any time in this field and recognized the players, they're not going to openly give it up. So by collecting this pilot and this scientist and this politician, and they sit in this long panel, all they have done is tighten up the news from the other side in order to keep that information quiet. Because the more you push back on them, the more you push them back. They push back on you. My father used to say all the time, in fact he said it in the book Alien Bases, I'm not here to accuse the officials. I'm not here to expose and to embarrass, because you don't get anywhere that way. How you get somewhere is by bringing the information out and by not putting people in jeopardy. I can tell you the amount of people I've talked to in government fields and in official fields and my family as well, and we honor their anonymity because the message is important, not the messenger. But people don't like that. They want to know that blah, 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 President blah, 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 or Prime Minister whoever has sanctioned this, so it's okay for me to believe it. And that's not how it works. So Mr. Greer tried, and there's an old saying, if you can't beat him, join him. And from what I've seen lately, he's decided to join him. Mm-hmm. Yes?
And Antarctica?
Oh, really quick. Antarctica. Well, there are no special places, right? In other words, if you need to use something, if they need to use a location, geographic location, then to them it's just the same as any other. Antarctica has special meaning to the rest of us because we are fighting over the resources that are there, the domination of who gets to use them and who's it belong to and what have you. And I've heard the stories about the Nazis and the super submarines and things like that. They were lucky just to get their personnel out of Germany in '44 because none of them were fried in the bunker. They all got the heck out. And that, God, everybody knew that. I was surprised that nobody followed through with that. And so going to Antarctica, you know, you hear once again the people who claim, well, there's a base for this, and they're doing a genetic study for that, and you know, talk is cheap. Where's the proof? And that comes to be another thing altogether. So, like I said, I personally don't worry about things like that. What they're doing down there, they're going to do, whether I like it or not. You know, Alternative 3, where we have military organized moon bases, and what they're going to do on the moon, and harness helium-3, and use it as a jumping-off point and an observation point. They're going to do whether I like it or not. I concern myself in life with what I can have an impact on, and I don't worry about all the rest of them or drive myself crazy with the thoughts of you know, what they may be saying and not saying, or what giving me and not giving me. When I pick up a paper, I read it, and then I read between the lines. And I look, okay, well, we did something stinking here in the Middle East. Who's to gain? What's the purposes behind it? What's the ramification? You have to think for yourselves. And once you do that, then you don't worry about things that are inconsequential. Like I said, if you know yourself, nobody's going to use you. Yeah.
I wondered about Stephen Greer's, back to him. He's supposedly trying to produce free energy devices. Do you know anything about it, or what's your opinion?
Well, a lot of people have worked on it. Basil Vandenberg did it using the Adamski symbols along with the one from Professor Homay in the Brazilian jungle. The Naval Laboratory in San Diego had used these type of devices, experimented with it. Once again, there was an Austrian scientist who developed it and went to Australia, and he had a device about the size of a refrigerator that powered the house. But the trouble is, if it's not shielded correctly, then it disrupts the telephone lines and the electrical lines of everybody else who complained, and the Australian government came and said, you can't use this anymore, and so off it went. I think we can all safely say that the oil cartels and the economies of our countries and our retirements and everything else is closely tied to the fossil fuels, right? It is not as much as it used to be because now we've changed to a military economy where the instigation of small wars are fueling and sustaining our economies. So whereas before it was pure oil, now we have worked on kind of in tandem. Now that's the things that Eisenhower warned people about in 1960 before he left office and told Kennedy about. And to move away, the Europeans have been much more successful at this. And you have wind generators, you have thermal generators. I have a cousin in Germany who's got the one that goes into the ground, you know, for the thermal heating and cooling, the wind turbine in the backyard that supplies electricity. You have a greater opportunity and extent for it here in the country that you're in, the countries you're in, because you have the ability to not be so controlled by the oil cartels. In the United States, oil and defense and politics, they're all sleeping together. And so the moment one takes office, they kill the programs and give money to the other one, and vice versa. It's an endless, stupid system, and I think here in Europe, you are in a much better circumstance. decommissioning the nuclear power plants, is thank God for that, because there is no safe way to store and contain the uranium. There's been not one single instance where it hasn't leaked. And so you're talking about radioactivity that is extremely deadly. So I think the continuation of that and solar power, I have solar on my house, it's wonderful. I use electricity, I don't have to pay for it, and it works very nice for me. So I think these natural resources and technology is a very good way to go. And we need to take a step forward. We do eventually have to cut the cord to the old and embrace the new. It's not that difficult. Is it really? Look how we lived in Europe here 40 years ago. I mean, my father used to tell to me, "What's the big deal about electrical power? You looked at the train system; it all worked at electricity at the turn of the century. It's not like it was a big deal. We're just doing it a little bit better. So let us work together and make a better world." If you and last message is that blame can go around to anywhere. We can point the finger any place we want, and that's not going to get us anywhere. Why do the space people come here? They come here to lend us a helping hand. They're not going to fix it for you. They're not fixing your problems. You made them, you fix them. But they give you guidance. And that guidance, if followed, can make a big difference. It's not really that difficult. Think of it as your parents. Your parents raised you. They gave you guidance. They looked out for you. And then set you upon the path to do it. There's not much difference there. And if we help each other a little bit, boy, how much easier this world would be. There's only so much pie, so let's share it rather than try to grab as much for ourselves and leave everybody else out. Good enough? Okay. Thank you for your time.